One of the comments that Huston Smith makes towards the beginning of his narrative on Christianity is to cite Albert Schweitzer's work, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, which was very popular and came to the conclusions that we know little of the life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And what we do know, we can at least say that his apocalypticism was wrong. And all that's meant by that comment, I believe, is that if Jesus thought that the end of the world was imminent, then he was wrong, which seems to be what Smith has in mind. But I think more than anything else, he wants to introduce Christianity with some kind of punch, with an unusual or at least unexpected comment. And so that's really what's meant there. Smith is giving a narrative account of each of the religions that he describes. And in general, he does so very well, but it's almost a play form. It's almost done in a dramatic form. And so it's important to keep in mind that he's trying to set a certain tone throughout what he's saying. So it's important to notice what he says and what he doesn't say, the elements that he highlights and the elements that he does not highlight and emphasize. So that being said, it is salient that the wonder worker side of Christ that we see in terms of performing miracles and healing and that sort of thing, that this draws upon potentially and is part of an established tradition in Judaism at that time of people who were going out to seek the divine through contemplation, isolation, potentially fasting, what have you. This is the normal sort of approach for gaining access to the divine in terms of visions and insight. And coming back then and performing wonders, there was a certain popular expectation, I think, for this sort of thing. We're going to encounter the same thing when we hear about Islam, that there was an expectation by the public that people who were infused with the divine would have something of this to offer. So that's certainly part of it. Now, he also says very flatly that Christianity is a historical religion. And this is something that, at the same time, we can't entirely disagree with. I think we can at least problematize that statement in challenging whether or not historicity of particular events is a sine qua non of Christianity. In other words, is the historicity of particular things something without which we would not have Christianity at all? Would it be something entirely different? And I think it might be difficult to argue in the way that he makes it sound this is the case. As if, in other words, the meaning of the individual events comes specifically from their historicity. In other words, the meaning of Christ's life and teaching and his divinity and resurrection and all of these other things, if those have meaning because they are historical events in time. And I want to cast this into some doubt because this is not always the way that it's been interpreted. This was the case for the church fathers and in medieval Christianity as well. While, of course, there is a historical emphasis and no one seriously doubted the historicity of these events, at the same time, there was a strain throughout this, not just this period, this length of time, you're talking about over a millennium, where the historicity of the events was not necessarily paramount. It was not necessarily the thing to emphasize, that the spiritual interpretation, the allegorical interpretation, one might even say the typological interpretation, these may have been more important than whether or not the events happened in exactly the way that is recounted in the scriptures. The concern with literalism and taking the statements in the Christian Bible as the literal truth, historical truth, and otherwise is more of a modern phenomenon than it is something that very easily applies to medieval and earlier periods. So, but we'll have more of that as we have occasion to touch in more detail there. But suffice to say, there are certain elements of Smith's presentation that may feel a little too easily comfortable to us. That ancient Christianity and medieval Christianity are different in ways that might be kind of surprising to us now. So, moving on. the environment that Christianity grew up in, and I've alluded to this in talking about Judaism. Judaism is highly orthopraxical. It's highly concerned with the practical elements of rite and ritual, moral practice, and how it is that you do things. Very much an externally focused religion in that way. And so there's a big emphasis there on tradition, on practice, on what you're doing, what you're saying, all the steps that you're following and this sort of thing. And Christianity represents a bit more of an inward turn. And the inward turn is accomplished, and this is where I think Smith really does a nice job, because this is something that's not easily captured in prose, but I think he does very well with it. The emphasis in Christianity is on love, and that God is love, even in the most extreme formulation that we see in the Gospel according to John, that God is love, and that Christ sought to emphasize God's love above the fear of God, above the practical natures of the rites and rituals and the practical considerations, especially of the law and the social order, is really crucial. And this is why it's so unusual and so noteworthy that Christ associated with all manner of people, having dinner with the harlots and the otherwise outcasts and these sorts of things, and bringing everyone together. And, all are equal before God and all are loved by God and that sort of thing. This was very much in tension with the established social order in Judaism of his day. And specifically, the social order that would have been upholding and defined by an adherence to the precepts as defined in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament. And so one thinks of the, literally hundreds of laws that one encounters, for instance, in Leviticus, and the Christian response to that, the New Testament, the teaching of Christ, can be thought of as a response to the laws and the social order established by the laws of the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible. So this is one of the principal ways, perhaps, that Christ's teaching was revolutionary for his time. And I think Smith really does very well in emphasizing this aspect of early Christianity. Now, all of that being said, I wonder at times in his presentation if he doesn't overemphasize certain things. For instance, he says that the teaching is true because you feel it in your heart, rather than this is meant to draw a distinction between doctrine. In other words, it's not true simply because you believe it or because you have given your assent in, Thomas Aquinas's sense of giving assent, that the will gives assent to belief. This is meant to draw a distinction with that. And there is a passage tucked away in Huston Smith's writing that I think brings a great deal of clarity to his presentation on this point, where he says that doctrine derives from experience. In other words, religious experience is primary and doctrine is secondary. It's not a minority opinion, but it's at the very least a contentious statement. It's something that is not a given in religious studies. And so this happens to be Smith's viewpoint, and it informs some of his statements here. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're reading his presentation, that he has in mind religious experience first and then doctrine only secondarily. So when he says that one of the novel and revolutionary things about Christianity is that it is felt. It is felt as opposed to being intellectually understood. In other words, perhaps to distinguish it from the writings of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers. We have to take this a little bit with a grain of salt, I think, while at the same time, any kind of doctrine that focuses on love, any kind of teaching that focuses on love, such as what you get from early Christianity, and also I'm thinking in particular from some of the Franciscan forms of mysticism in the Middle Ages, such as St. Bonaventure and the like. The emphasis on love there very much is anti-intellective in a way, and does emphasize experience. Whether it emphasizes experience over all orthodoxy, as Smith seems to want to do, is not clear, and is probably not the case in many cases. But at the same time, mysticism provides a challenge to orthodoxy in just that way, in insisting upon the authority of experience over dogma and over any kind of doctrine. And so this is the way that Smith is depicting things. Again, take that for what it's worth. Now, Smith also says that in love and in experiencing the love that Christ was teaching in early Christianity, that someone would come to be rid of, he says, three things. This is on page 333. He says, fear of death, guilt, and the ego. Now, fear of death is something that we'll have occasion to talk more about, especially when we're discussing Joseph Campbell, because he suggests that that's the root of religious sentiment. And this is something that David Hume will also echo in his work, saying that fear is the fundamental emotion from which we get religion. But at the very least, it's fairly obvious that if religion is going to be effective, surely it must address this particular need. So that it addresses fear of death is probably nothing surprising. That it addresses the ego may be more surprising to you, but if you're a student of religion, this is going to be less surprising. Religions generally do address this and do a great deal to quell the ego, selfish desires. The 7 deadly sins are sins of desire. And more often than not, the moral codes in various religions specifically address selfish desire. And so in overcoming selfish desire, one naturally shrinks or annihilates entirely the whatever the conception of the ego happens to be. So those are perhaps not as contentious. The one that I want to draw attention to is his claim that this experience of love does away with guilt. And guilt is a particularly interesting example here because guilt is often thought to be one of the problems associated, especially with modern forms of religion. And it's not clear that guilt is something that is ubiquitous in the way that one would need to get rid of it, as Smith seems to suggest. I think it might seem a little too easy to us to think that, well, of course you have guilt. You know, that seems to be part of the human condition almost, but it's not clear if this isn't simply part of our culture rather than being part of the human condition to be so strongly predisposed to guilt, such that it would make for one of the top 3 things that he says that this religion of love allows you to overcome. So anyway, food for thought there, again in his presentation. So one of the issues there as well is this discussion and the way that he poses that question of the 3 things that Christianity allows you to get over, the religion of love allows you to get over, this experience of divine love. It makes it sound as though you have a certain number of needs, and these needs must be met by religion in order for it to be a live option. And while this is perhaps a reasonable and certainly intuitive way of speaking, it's not a given that this is the right way of speaking about religion, as though we had certain needs that need to be met, and as long as the religion fits those particular needs, then it's going to be a viable option for us. It's not always clear that that's the case. It certainly seems to be the case in certain instances. For instance, when we read of Saint Augustine in the Confessions, he was a follower of Manichaeism for a while. Well, Manichaeism seems to fit his personality. It seems to have met a number of needs. In other words, it seems to have gone greatly in the service of what his own psychological needs might have been. But that may or may not tell the full story of why it was viable for him and why it is that Christianity was able to overcome this. In his own case, he provides a narrative for it. But again, the reasons that we think that we have for believing something may not really be the reasons that we have for believing something. In other words, just because we think that's how it works, it doesn't mean that that's really how it works. Our belief that, this is the reason that I think these things does not actually cause us to think those things. It's something that we have retrospectively and by looking and trying to figure out what's going on. So anyway, one explanation among many that are possible. It's just not clear that the way that he's presenting this tells the full story. So again, these are certain kind of problems and issues to keep in mind. Now, one thing that I think is particularly nice, and I've already said that I enjoyed his presentation of and his characterization of Christianity's novelty with respect to the emphasis on love. And one of the things that he has to say, and this is page 334, is that love is a response. He says, love is an answering phenomenon. It is literally a response. In other words, if you love someone, then there is a certain kind of action-reaction sort of thing that goes on there. And this is a really nice way of thinking about it, I believe. Now, whether or not this is 100% accurate across the board, I don't know, but it certainly provides us with a nice tool for getting inside the idea and for trying to understand some of how it is that this might work. In other words, as Christ preached to love your neighbor as yourself, if you love your neighbor as yourself, practically speaking, the very act of showing love to your neighbor is going to elicit a certain kind of response. Now, it's not going to be the same with every person because every person is different and predisposed to react differently to different things. But that being said, there is a certain pattern, of course, that one notices. I mean, this is very simple. One of the, kind of to put it in a much simpler and prosaic context, in talking to a child about how to make friends, what is the best way to make friends? Well, you be a friend. If you are a friend to someone, they're going to be more likely to open up and become a friend to you. And this is, I think, some of what Smith has in mind in terms of thinking about love as an answering phenomenon. In other words, if we show another person love, they're going to be much more likely to open up to us, to be predisposed or to be disposed to us in a certain favorable way, and to create this kind of cycle of, favorable feelings and goodness between people. So I think that's really a valuable thing to see and to kind of think about, well, how does this really work? That Christ was preaching this kind of behavior specifically, because what we're talking about here really is a behavior. This is a moral injunction to treat people well and to say that if you treat them well, if you show them love specifically and love equally into all things as a goal, then it does something, and there's something potentially very interesting that happens there. And there is a long history of this sort of thing, not only in Christianity, but in a number of other religions. The Buddhist equivalent of this is metta. And in Islam, we have the same sort of stories and the same sort of poetry, especially with the Sufis being done. So we see this kind of thing all over the place. There's this thought that if we love others spread broadly. So perhaps beginning with, those that we are closest to, and then widening that net until it includes everyone and everything, then there's something special that happens. This is consistently what we hear, that if we do this, then it eventually affects the way that we see the world, that we relate to the world, and our own psychological health and anything and everything effectively. And that this is thought of as being the central conduit to the divine has been expressed by, not a few, not only mystics, but saints and otherwise religious figures. So, I mean, this is clearly an important idea. And there is something that really resonates, I think, with that idea in religious history. I don't think it's hard at all to make that argument. And so when Smith is saying that Christianity is doing something distinct and valuable by doing this, it's probably an easy argument to make, but it might be a little too easy. Because, of course, why wasn't this done before? I mean, if this is such an obvious point, then why wasn't it done before? And I think this is really where we have to start talking about the inward turn. And this is why I tried to introduce the topic by doing this, in saying that whereas in traditional religion and with Judaism is kind of a midpoint there, we have more of an exoteric focus where there's a focus on external acts, on tradition, on rites and ritual, and this sort of thing. Christianity represents a time in which we have more of an inward turning. And the inward turning is something that we can see in centuries previous to this in Greek philosophy even, because the very nature of philosophy is for it not to be entirely exoteric. In other words, for it to be esoteric, for it to be specific to the insight and learning of individuals. And so this is a similar sort of thing that we see in early Christianity. And I do mean to juxtapose the two and to even compare to some extent with respect to Christianity and Greek philosophy, because as Festugière said, this is the early 20th century scholar of religion, that when the early church fathers philosophize, they Platonize. And this was something that was to a great extent canonical almost in the early church, where Greek philosophy was much more accepted, I think, than it would be in later times. And now even really, Augustine was very obviously a Platonist, as were many of the other church fathers, and many of them built from Neoplatonic origins. And we're going to see this as we step through some of these figures and go through that history. So while it might seem obvious to us that there should be a rift between Christianity and Greek philosophy, especially even if you study Greek philosophy, you're going to hear that there's a rift between Greek philosophy and Greek religion, which is to some extent true, even though Plato is a great exponent of that perspective, of that worldview that informs Greek polytheism. Nevertheless, Christianity and Greek philosophy got along in great measure in the early centuries. And so, and even throughout, the tone changed from one that was principally Platonic to one that was more Aristotelian in the Middle Ages. And this is especially true, of course, with people like Thomas Aquinas, who really tries to synthesize Aristotle with Christianity. Greek philosophy has always gotten along very well with Christianity. And so this leads some to say, for instance, with Augustine, that everything in Christianity, he says, aside from the incarnation, can be found in Plato. And this is something that Meister Eckhart, for one, picks up later on and says, well, no, even the incarnation, even that can be found there. We'll talk about that more as we get there, but just kind of throw that out at this point as a kind of curiosity. Okay, so by the time we get to page 340 with Smith, we can see his comment that I alluded to earlier, that religion derives from experience and that theology and all doctrine derive from experience. And he says, we can define theology as the systematization of thoughts about the symbols that religious experience gives rise to. So the symbols, or what religious experience gives rise to, that they are symbols is interesting in and of itself as well. And that the theology that is derivative therefrom is secondary to the experience is, of course, going to be, as I said before, something that not everyone subscribes to. Nevertheless, now, a word about them being symbols. This is also easy for us to overestimate in terms of it's easy for us to import our own, what we're used to hearing, at least our own modern conceptions, into the ancient world. The ancients, by and large, were more willing to pursue more of an allegorical interpretation, to pursue more symbolic interpretations, and to more freely interpret things. And this is true throughout the ancient world to some extent, and then into the Middle Ages. There was a strong tradition of trying to get to the spiritual kernel that was beneath the surface, and that this was something that was not necessarily going to be obvious, and then one must, do some exploration and interpretation and contemplation to try and get to the spiritual truths that were not necessarily contained on the surface. And this is, again, something that we get with Augustine, where he says that every true interpretation is a literal interpretation. And this, I think, flies in the face of what we're accustomed to hearing now. But this should provide us with some perspective that, perhaps the history of Christianity is not always what you think. And that people like Augustine, and indeed even some of the medieval thinkers, far from simply, stoning or burning all those who objected to a literal interpretation of the Bible, in fact, their interpretive practices were in some cases much freer than what we are accustomed to now.